I want to ask a question to begin the message today. Today is going to be more of a Bible study. So I know it's a little dark outside and it's a little cool in here, so hopefully I'll keep you all awake, but we are going to crank through the scriptures today as we discuss a topic that you may or may not have studied for some years. I want to ask this question. How many of you have heard or read about the possibility of there being a 7-year tribulation? How many of you have ever seen that with different Christian groups, evangelical groups? How many of you have heard of the potential of a 7-year tribulation? Raise your hand if you've seen that or read that. I wondered. It looks like maybe 1/7 or 1/8 of you. Of course, we in the church have understood there to be a 3.5-year tribulation, but I will state that it is not uncommon, and in fact, it's very common out in the various Christian groups that are groups that believe that Christ will come prior to the world destroying itself, as we would say, unless Christ came, no flesh would be saved alive. There are quite a few groups out there that believe that must happen, that believe that there should be or there will be a 7-year tribulation, not a 3.5-year tribulation. Do you know from where they would come up with that thought? Well, we're going to talk about that today as we address it. I want to introduce it. I've been thinking about covering this for some time, but it kind of hit home yesterday as I was driving up to go to the funeral service and was listening on the radio as they were talking about it. There was a host for a radio show that was talking, just kind of summing up this past year, just thinking about everything that's happened. This was 770 AM, so it's changed over to a Christian station now, and there are several different groups that are on there. But this particular host was talking about the events that have happened this year with respect to how that fits into prophecy. And one of the things that he really honed in on was what happened here in most recent weeks. Specifically, President Trump saying what he said about acknowledging Jerusalem to be the capital city of Israel. I think most of you were aware of that. Happened here this past month, and the uproar that caused in the international community, specifically with the United Nations. I don't know, nearly all of those in the United Nations were totally against that Trump would actually acknowledge that and lead in that way in stating that we as America recognize Jerusalem, and we are formally recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and thus we will place our embassy now in Jerusalem as opposed to Tel Aviv, I believe was the previous location. And the uproar that caused. It was either that individual that was talking there, or it could have been also another radio station that I was listening to a little bit later where the individual was talking about the difference in the divide that we have in our country presently. On the one hand, we've got what would be considered, I guess, more of a progressive liberal view of a globalization is what we need versus more of the conservative view of a more nationalistic view, America first versus more of a global government kind of a thing. Well, this guy that was talking on the radio that was backing that was the church-sponsored program was talking about how much he marveled how Trump did this and the impact of Trump's action in terms of what that may cause to have happen here in the ensuing years. And here's how he explained it. He said, now if Mrs. Hillary Clinton had become president, then we would have moved much more towards a globalization. But with what Trump has done, Trump, because of what he did, he forced a situation to where we as America stand alone and we side with Israel. So as a result of our siding with Israel, we are demonstrating that we are not part of global Babylon. And you know, when he was talking about global Babylon, he was talking about also the beast power and, you know, false prophet, all of that. And so he was applauding Trump for our staying out of the globalization, the one world government that will come on the scene at the very end, that will ultimately be fighting against Christ when Christ returns. So America, as a result of siding with Israel, he then says, and then he quotes Revelation 12. So let's go to Revelation 12. We don't believe this, by the way, as I think you know, but I want to cover that here briefly. Because this is a thought that is out there amongst many of the evangelicals that preach that Christ has to return before the end of all things, and he's got to save humanity, as we mentioned at the outset. So he went on to say that Revelation 12 pictures Israel all the way up till the end time. Now, we would read, I don't want to go into the details of this, we would read Revelation 12 in the beginning. Great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. We've always understood that to be a representation of the Old Testament church in the wilderness. 12 tribes, 12 stars. But as things progress through the chapter, and now as we look down around verse 9, a familiar passage that we know, all the way through the end of verse 17. These are end-time events that we have always understood to represent the church, what the church is dealing with, the spiritual Israel of God. Well, what this individual was doing was seeing this more of Revelation 12. The entirety is a discussion of Israel. And now, again, remember, when he says Israel, to what is he referring? He's not referring to the same thing that we understand to be Israel. We understand Israel as the modern-day descendants of Jacob, of course, America as Manasseh, Britain as and the Commonwealth as Ephraim, all of that. No, this guy was seeing this from the standpoint of Israel. And so at the end time, now because America is standing alone from the rest of the global world economy, and not global world economy, but the globalization, the one world government kind of view, because Trump is standing away from that, he sees this passage here as when the devil knows that he has a short time in verse 14, but the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she's nourished for a time, times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. His belief is that America, because America has sided with Israel, America will be protected during the final time until America comes at the end to support Israel as the beast and the false prophet comes, and America then fights alongside with Christ and defeats Satan and his armies. That's not what we teach. That's not what we teach, yet that is a common belief and that is out there. Now, there are different groups such as the Seventh-day Adventists. They teach a 7-year tribulation. And then again, there are other groups like such as this evangelical that believes that this is a 7-year period that takes place of the events, tribulation that lead up to the return of Christ. Now, where do they get that phrase or that understanding? Coming back to what he said, he stated this. He said, this whole one world government, America, by siding with Israel, is separate of the beast power. So America will be protected. And since America is choosing not to be a part of that final beast Babylonian system, will thus be protected, it's so important that we support Trump's agenda. And what his feeling is that because Trump has led in that direction to do what Trump has done, to acknowledge Israel, it's forcing the rest of the world to then acknowledge that. Are we either going to acknowledge that, the UN, are they going to acknowledge that that change has happened, or are they not? And his belief is that by Trump leading the way, it's going to force the UN to then come in and make some type of an agreement with Israel. Now, that's important in their theology, in their prophecy theology, because he said, and I start getting excited when I hear that, because he says that starts the clock. That starts the 7-year tribulation clock. What do you mean? How does that set the 7-year tribulation clock? It sets the 7-year tribulation clock because there is this global power, the UN or whatever comprises that, comes in and makes a covenant. It confirms a covenant, or it makes an agreement with Israel, and that starts the 7-year time period. So halfway between, it breaks that covenant, and then everything completely comes unraveled. Where would he get that thought? And that gets to the topic that we want to cover today, because that's not how we have understood the passage to which that individual is referring. Do you know what we're talking about? It's in Daniel 9. Let's go to Daniel 9. So we're going to have to really put on our thinking caps today, because we're going to hit a passage of Scripture that can be very difficult sometimes to understand. The church years ago, I think it was about 14 years ago, put together a study paper on the very subject that we're going to cover today. It's called the 70 Weeks Prophecy. How many of you have studied the 70 Weeks Prophecy within the last 2 years? A few of you. Okay, good. So I'll be turning to Ms. Sweat and Mr. Buchanan for further comments as we get going. Becky just sat up in her seat. Did you notice that? She just adjusted and sat up in her seat. Anyway, so we'll talk about some of this. We won't go into the details of this. Of course, Mr. Meeker talked about this to some degree in his Daniel and Revelation study that was ongoing, that was going here this past year. But it's a fascinating subject. It's like Daniel 11. It's one of those major detailed kinds of studies. But let's look at Daniel 9 today as we deal with what's called the 70 weeks prophecy. There is much of what we can say, we really think it's probably this. There are some things that we say we cannot know for certain. But does it have merit to cover in services? I believe so, yes. I believe, as Mr. Armstrong often said, there is this huge part, up to a third of Scripture that deals with prophecy, and this prophecy is here. So it's important that we look at it. Before we get to it, though, it's important for us to differentiate between the 70 weeks prophecy and the 70 years prophecy. What's the difference? Daniel 9:1. Let's look at the 70 years prophecy. I think many of you are aware of this. Maybe there are a bunch of you that are not. But we see here in Daniel 9 verse 1, which is the same time where Daniel has this vision or this prophecy of the 70 weeks explained. First, it talks about the 70 years, two different prophecies. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the reign of the realm of the Chaldeans. This is circa 538 BC. Okay, we've got Babylon conquered the southern kingdom, and then here comes Persia, and they conquer Babylon, and Cyrus is king, and Darius is made now king over the area of Babylon that now belongs to the Medes, okay? So this happens in 538 BC. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Eternal through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So it's important to understand this is different from the 70 weeks prophecy. The 70 years prophecy goes back to the captivity of ultimately of Jerusalem until the time that the temple is rededicated. There were several initial captivities, 604, 597, and 586 or so BC, different captivities that Babylon had upon the southern kingdom. But the ultimate one was, which led to Zedekiah, the final king, being captured and taken to Babylon, and having his sons killed before his eyes, and then having his eyes put out. That was 586 BC. So you go 586 BC, 585, 586 BC, 70 years down the road from that, so you would subtract as you go forward in time, and you come to 515 BC. Let's look at just a couple of quick references here. Let's go to Jeremiah 25, I think it's Jeremiah 25:11. Jeremiah 25:11. You know, as we look on the world scene right now and we see what's going on, what will we see happen in the next year? We've got all kinds of situations going here this week. South Koreans stopped a ship that was transporting oil to North Korea via Hong Kong. To what degree was China involved in that as they're trying to determine that? A lot of unrest in the East. Middle East, of course, is in continued upheaval. Right now, Europe is flailing to try to find its identity. There was a recent poll in Germany of what should we do with respect to our nation and with respect to the European community, and a significant number of people in Germany are calling for a more unified European state that has military power to deal with all of the situations that are going on right now. Europe is flailing. Russia is pushing. All the different things, Britain has exited that whole situation. All of the things, and again, what's happening with Islamic terrorism as ISIS is crumbling, but other things are forming continually. So we see here in what I say, Jeremiah 25:11. Jeremiah 25:11, the statement is made about this 75 years. This is during Jeremiah's prophecy. He was somewhat concurrent with Daniel. Jeremiah 25:11, and this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So that time period lapsed, and come 515 BC, we have the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem. So that's the 70-year prophecy. Much different from the 70 weeks prophecy that we're about to read about. Fascinating thing with, again, the situation of Jeremiah. We've talked about this before, and of course, Mr. Jones talks about this in the book of the United States and Britain and the Commonwealth in prophecy. But you've got Jeremiah looks after the king's daughters, King Zedekiah's daughters. When Zedekiah's sons are all killed, Jeremiah is looking after and protecting the king's daughters. And of course, different historical documents have been written about him taking them on up into the British Isles later, and that would be our understanding of how that Davidic line continues to this very day, to where the queen, a descendant of King David, Queen Elizabeth II, sits on the throne. Again, speaking to the kind of individual that King David was, as was discussed in the sermonette. But we have this time period. That's a 70-year period that ended at the time of 515, as many of those who were in captivity came back and they were able to rededicate the temple, and this process of Judah getting back to that land continue. So with that as a backdrop, now let's address this 70 weeks. Because again, what we've got to deal with today are what is really going on here in this 70 weeks prophecy. It's basically from verse 24 to verse 27. 4 verses is all we're talking about here, but it is a detailed prophecy. What is really going on here, and what is the difference? Because what we're going to do is we're going to address why there are groups that believe that the tribulation period lasts 7 years versus our group, which believes that it's more of a 3.5-year period. Okay, and some of the translation issues as a result. So let's start in verse 20 and kind of lead up to it. So this is in 538 BC when Daniel is revealed the meaning of this 70 weeks prophecy. While I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, presenting my supplication before the eternal my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, one of the messengers of God, Gabriel the angel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications, as soon as you started praying and reaching out to God and making supplication, he says, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. Okay, so now we come to this statement here in verse 24. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. We're just going to read right through verse 25. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Okay, remember we said 70 weeks are determined, so what's 7 plus 62? 69. So there's still a week out there. He said, until Messiah the priest, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. That's another way of just saying 69 weeks. The streets shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. So what is going on there? Now, so let's first address some of that. And by doing that, it's critical to understand in the 70 weeks prophecy, what is the central theme, or what is the central figure of the 70 weeks prophecy? That's a huge part in understanding this prophecy. And the answer to that is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the central focus of all of this. There are some ancillary matters that are discussed, but the primary focus of this passage rests on Christ. And that helps us in being able to discern what's going on. Okay, all right. So at this point, let's backtrack here. We're going to come and deal with these 6 statements here in just a second, and I'll be quoting a little bit from our old study paper on the subject here in just a bit. But we're going to deal with those 6, but let's come and deal with the first part of verse 24 and verse 25. So he says 70 weeks are determined. Now, you look at Numbers 14 and Ezekiel 4, we have the day for a year principle. So in terms of prophecy, we see that a lot. So figuring that, and I should have had this up on the screen, not on the Christmas tree that's hiding there, but on the screen over here, that you've got 70 weeks. How many days are in a week? 7. 70 times 7 equals 490. So a day for a year principle would be 70 weeks would be the same as saying 490 years. Okay. Now remember, we saw here in verse 25 that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the priest, there shall be 7 and 62 weeks, which is 69 weeks. If 490 days is 70 weeks, how many would 483, 69 weeks would be 483. Get that? Clear as mud? So 69 weeks, 69 times 7, multiply that out. No, you don't say out. Multiply it. Multiply it. Multiply it. Multiply 69 times 7, and that gets you to 483. Okay, so write that down, 483. All right. So we've got to figure out this time, this day for a year, weeks prophecy of when is this taking place? Well, how do we determine when it took place? How do we determine the starting date for the 70 weeks prophecy? What's it say? What's the key focus there? It's in verse 25. That from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem shall be then 69 weeks. So, when was the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem? We won't go into the details of that. There are 4 different decrees that we see. One was 538, another one was 520, another one was 457 by Artaxerxes, and then Artaxerxes made another decree in Nehemiah's time in 444. But anyway, of those 4, it's going to be one of those dates of the different times when that was decreed. So as we look at those, the one that seems to make the most sense is 457 BC. Now, what was significant about that? Let's go to Ezra 7. We'll come back to Daniel 9 here in a second. I'm telling you, we got to think today, all right? We got to think. It's not an easy cruising day here. We got to stay with me on this now as we go through it. Ezra 7. Ezra 7. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Artaxerxes was one of the kings of Persia, and he made a decree in his 7th year. Look at verse 1. Now after these things, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, this was Artaxerxes the first, who's Persian king, whose reign began in 465, 464 BC. So we drop down here. It says, some of the children of Israel, the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, the Nethinim, came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. The 7th year of King Artaxerxes was circa 457 BC. Okay, so write that down. 457. So we've got 2 numbers right now. We've got the 69 weeks, which is 483 years, and we've got the 457, which is this decree that Artaxerxes makes in his 7th year. Look at verse 12. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, a scribe of the law of God of heaven, perfect peace, and so forth. And then he issues this decree of what needs to happen to go back and do this. All right, so let's then factor as we would calculate that time period. Let's calculate that. So if you were to take 457 BC and add 483 years to it, what do you come up with? Quick math, people. That you've got. Remember now, you're going into AD. From BC into AD, so how would you add that or subtract to get to the date? And what date, with what date do you arrive? At what date do you arrive? Anyone? 27 or 26. 26 AD. But you've got no year 0 in the switchover from BC to AC, so it comes to 27 AD. So 457, and then the 69 weeks, 69 times 7 is 483. 483 brings you to 27 AD. What's significant about 27 AD? It's when Jesus Christ begins his ministry. He begins his ministry in 27 AD. in the fall of 27 AD. Now that's significant again because we come back now to Daniel 9. We come back to that again, and we're focusing on realizing the centrality of this message is the role of Jesus Christ, and what Jesus Christ does in his ministry, and also the reality of what the reality of what Jesus Christ does in the final week of his ministry. Because the 69 weeks, 7 plus the 62, the 69 weeks end at 27 AD when Jesus Christ comes on the scene, right? So now we've got this final week, the 70th week, day for a year, that would be 7 years that need to be fulfilled. And so this is talking about what then begins to happen as a result of this time period. Fascinating, again, that God would reveal this to Daniel at this time back in 538 BC of what was to happen not only 500 plus years later, but also a type of what's to happen at the very end. So let's come back now to Daniel 9, verse 24, and address these 6 things that are talked about here. Again, these all come back to things that Jesus Christ did or will yet do. The first 3 deal with sin, and the last 3 deal with aspects that we come to realize, well, this hasn't occurred yet in full. Okay, so now I'll quote some from the study paper here as we go forward and look at this. So let's look at these quickly here. Daniel 9, verse 24, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. First one, to finish the transgression. To finish the transgression. The term finish is dealing with this whole aspect of restraining or shutting up. The Hebrew word there is kala. It can also mean that. The transgression or the rebellion, the pesha, P-E-S-H-A. He came to shut up or restrain the rebellion. And we think about that from a Christian standpoint, as God calls us to his way of life, and through the sacrifice of Christ, we turn from rebelling against him. We were once opposed to him, and we're now no longer in rebellion against him, but following him. So in part, we see a role of Christ in this particular thing in our lives now. So to restrain or to shut up rebellion against him, to make an end of sins. Sins there is that typical missing the mark. The term here, some commentators, this is from the paper, make an end of as meaning to seal up or stop with a view towards punishment, to stop the missing of the mark. And again, we see Christ, we know that Christ as Messiah will direct his people towards the true mark, as the paper brings out, making an end of sin as a way of life. And we still have sin, we still battle with sin, but to walk in sin, we don't do that. We make an end to that as a way of life. The whole process began when Christ gave his life to eliminate sin, and it culminates ultimately with his return. So we see that aspect of Christ's role. And then it also says in verse 24, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Christ, we are reconciled by Christ's sacrifice. We have been reconciled to God through the sacrifice of Christ. Reconciliation is now available through the sacrifice of Christ, even though the ultimate fulfillment for all of mankind doesn't happen until Christ returns and begins working with all of humanity and begins then that process. But the ministry of the new covenant is working with us now. It's a ministry of reconciliation, and that will begin to completely explode in a positive way at Christ's return. So we see these first 3 to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Christ, at the end of his 3.5-year ministry, What ended that? What ended his ministry? His death. He died at 3.5 years. And through his ministry, he did those three things. Those three things are in effect in our lives now through the ministry of Jesus Christ and ultimately through his sacrifice, his resurrection, and his role now as high priest beside God. But then now look at these next three. These are things yet to come. Again, remember, this whole focus is on Jesus Christ. These whole three verses of what Christ is doing and will do. The next one, to bring in everlasting righteousness. Has he done that now? Are we in a situation of everlasting righteousness? We're not. The people that have God's Spirit, we are in that process, but this everlasting righteousness, that is future. That is a future thing. It reflects the conditions where righteousness will be the characterization of humanity as they're moving forward. So that's a future event that Christ will do. That will be something that will happen later. And the next one, to seal up vision and prophecy. Now that's an interesting statement, to seal up vision in prophecy. And the paper brings a little bit out with this that I think bears merit in discussing. The fifth seal, to seal up vision and prophecy, is an evident reference to that future time when the warning messages of the prophets are no longer needed. When the Messiah is enthroned, Jesus Christ has returned, he's sitting on his throne during the millennial reign. When that's happening, the need for the prophetic warning messages as needed in the past will be greatly diminished, if not eliminated. Most of the major prophecies will have been fulfilled, and it will simply be a matter of the carrying out of those that remain to be fulfilled. So that is, again, in terms of this thing of sealing up vision and prophecy, that's something that is happening in future time. And then lastly, and to anoint the most holy. And to anoint the most holy. Now, while it could be said that Christ will be anointed King of Kings, Lord of Lords, to come and return and set up his throne, most would state that this is not necessarily meaning that directly as the margin renders the most holy place, speaking of anointing the most holy place of where the temple, the future temple, will be placed, and that will be a millennial thing as we look at the end of Ezekiel and see those teachings as well. So the anointing of the tabernacle, where the King of Kings and Lord of Lords will make this is a most holy place here. Again, not negating that Christ is also anointed. But I guess what we're getting at is we pull back to verse 24. We look at all of these things, this time period of then what begins to occur. Okay, so he says in verse 25, let's continue on now. So know therefore and understand that from the going forth of this command to restore and build Jerusalem, 457 BC, until Messiah the Prince, when he comes on the scene, as in his ministry at 27 AD, we would say, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, 69 weeks. So this building up takes place again as he begins to establish his church. Now, so we come now to verse 26. Verses 26 and 27, if we come back to the very beginning of the message, that's where we get into this discussion of how some folks can come into this understanding that they think there's a 7-year tribulation versus a 3.5-year tribulation. And I didn't get into details of this, but there are many groups as well that believe that believe the rapture occurs maybe even before that, that there's a secret coming of Christ as a thief in the night, a secret coming, and rapturing these people off, and then there's this 7 years of tribulation that follows, which again we do not teach that from that in that manner as they do. So what we'll do now is look at verses 26 and 27 and see how they come to that conclusion versus what we understand to be the meaning of this prophecy. So verse 26. After the 62 weeks, it's not saying 62 minus the 7. Remember the prophecy before said 7 weeks and then 62 weeks makes 69 weeks. So after the 62 weeks, this chunk, which would also include the 7 weeks, after the 62 weeks, so at the 69 weeks, it says Messiah shall be cut off. Messiah. So speaking of Christ, at some point here, he's going to be cut off. Now, look down to verse 27. We'll jump ahead really quickly. It says, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Okay, so 69 weeks, you've got this final week, but in the middle of the week he brings an end to that. So what would we say to that? How would we explain that? 3.5-year ministry? Half of a week, middle of the week, 3.5 years after his ministry, Christ died, right? Christ was killed. He was the sacrifice. Jesus Christ, during his ministry, confirmed the law, confirmed the covenant. We'll talk more about that in a second. But he was cut off in the middle of the week. He was cut off in the middle of a 7-year ministry. He was also cut off in the middle of the week, wasn't he? He was cut off on a Wednesday. So as we look at verses 26 and 27, we see that as talking about Christ. Let's come back to it again. Verse 26, so after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city, speaking of Jerusalem, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood, until the end of the war, desolations are determined. So there are people that are representing this prince that are going to come in and really tear up the city, destroy the city. Okay, so let's think now back in history of when those times happened. We see types of that leading to the ultimate type. But what are the types? 168 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes, the abomination and desolation set up, offering swine's flesh on the altar. And then we see shortly after Christ's death, 70 A.D., Titus, the Roman emperor, came in, destroyed Jerusalem. So we've got all that going on. But this is a reference again to the future time near the end of the people of the prince. Who were the people of the prince, in a sense, in 70 A.D. who destroyed the city? The people, I heard it, the people would be the Romans, and of the prince, who would have been the Caesar at the time, came in and destroyed that. Well, at the end, all of the things that are going to happen at Jerusalem prior to the return of Christ will be the result of whom? The final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire with the beast power, the false prophet there. So we see that parallel happening. The people of the prince will come in at the end and destroy that city. Now we come to verse 27. Now here is the key difference that we have with others that would teach this 7-year kind of a situation of the tribulation. Look at verse 27. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Day for a year, 7 years. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Okay. Now, here's where it differs. First, I'm going to tell you how the folks that believe in the 7-year tribulation, where they go with this. Verse 27, when they say, then he, they determine that he is the prince. The prince. they believe that he comes in and makes a covenant. And as I'm now I'm going back to that original conversation that the radio host was having. This global world power, this is not what we teach, okay? But this global world power, be it the UN or whatever they think is that's going to be, they come in and they make an agreement with Israel, and everything is all hunky-dory for that week. But what's really happening is it's a sleight of hand. It's a trickery that they engage in. And of course, this guy was thinking, well, they have to because Trump has done this, so they've got to come in and make this agreement. So they make this agreement, and then that starts the clock. That's the 7-year tribulation. And halfway through it, all of a sudden, they turn on it. They turn on it, that prince turns on it, and then everything goes south in a hurry, and everything gets torn up prior to the return of Christ. That's how they come to those seven days, and I mean that 7 week, that 1 week, 7 days, 7-year period of a tribulation, where it starts with them getting involved then. The problem with that is several-fold, and this is why we don't go with that teaching in that respect, is because of how you determine who he is. One is, as we come back to originally what we discussed, this whole prophecy primarily centers on Jesus Christ, okay? We read all 6 of those things that he did, and the Messiah, the Prince, until Messiah, the Prince, does what he does in verse 25, and then at the 62 weeks, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off. As we look at that, we see verse 27 when it says, then he shall confirm a covenant. It is speaking of Jesus Christ, not some world power leader that is really representative of the final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire that comes in and works some angle with Israel. No, we believe that it's talking there about Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ shall confirm a covenant, or as the margin renders, or those of you that have Hebrew there, it is shall make a firm covenant. Now, this term covenant is brith, B-R-I-T-H, Brit. It's where you get the term covenant, of entering into a covenant. And in all of Daniel, when this term is used, it's always talking about God's covenant that he makes with Israel, the covenant that he makes, God's law, his covenant, his agreement there. So what you have to do to take this over to think that, oh, no, this is some guy that's doing this. It's not talking about Christ. So he's getting in and making some kind of a deal or some kind of a treaty only to break it later. We wouldn't say that. We'd say, no, this is talking about Christ. Christ came in his ministry, in his 3.5 years, half of the week of ministry, in his 3.5 years, he came and made a firm covenant. What did Christ do? Christ came and magnified the law. You know, I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law, to fill it up, to confirm the law, to confirm the truth of God's way, to expand the understanding of God's law with the spiritual intent in mind. Christ came and did that and established that even more powerfully as he spent his ministry here on this earth. He did that in his time, but in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Well, how did Christ bring an end to sacrifice and offering? by dying and being that sacrifice. By dying and being that sacrifice for sin, he will no longer do we need the offerings to cover the sins that we make. Christ's blood, his one sacrifice, brought an end to sacrifice and offering. Okay, we got that? Okay, but not to mess things up too much, but take that over here now. We do know that what we do know what's going to happen at the end. The king of the south, now we're going to Daniel, what is it, Daniel 11? Where, the king of the south is going to push against the kingdom of the north, right? Which ultimately is that Holy Roman Empire. The king of the north sweeps down and destroys the king of the south and sets up shop between the two seas in Jerusalem, sets up shop and sets up business, sets up throne representing God, so to speak, on the throne there. The false prophet and the beast power ruling there in Jerusalem. And in that, they are going to, again, have the fulfillment of the abomination that makes desolate. They're going to come in then and defile that area where sacrifices are being offered. We know that. Yes, that is what is prophesied to happen. So in order for that to happen, what offerings and sacrifices will need to be taking place in Jerusalem for them to come down and stop that from happening. But again, that is different than over here as we're talking about Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, and this is a significant point that the paper brings out that I wanted to which I wanted to draw attention. If I can find it here. Right. Christ's sacrifice brings an end to the need for sacrifice. Okay? Because of his sacrifice being cut off in the middle of the week, we no longer have the need to sacrifice because Jesus Christ is our sacrifice. The abomination of desolation will stop the Jews from doing their sacrifices. See the difference? They're going to be setting up sacrifices and doing that again, and that's going to be shut off by that king of the north that comes down and the false prophet and the beast power there. So we've got these two different concepts going. Both of these are true. This will happen and this will happen. But the difficulty is what happens is that folks read this and they look at it from the standpoint of this referring to this prince versus the one who was Jesus Christ, who did actually bring an end to sacrifice and offering by sacrificing his life. One other little point for the grammar folks out there that creates a problem in stating that he has to be this prince of the dark side, so to speak. Looking at it again in verse 26, and after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Messiah is the subject of that sentence, of that discussion. And then we come down to, and the people of the prince. Well, when we look at verse 17, we know that he can't be people because he is singular. So people, it can't be talking about the people here. So it's either talking about the Messiah in verse 27, that he shall confirm a covenant, or it's talking about the prince. Well, the problem with it being the prince is the object of the prepositional phrase. It is a side little statement here of the prince. It's not the main thrust of the discussion. So it makes sense grammatically that it would continue to be a discussion of Jesus Christ as opposed to a discussion of this person that is the object of the preposition. Little grammar there. So another issue that creates problems. So we see then, coming back to verse 27 as we wrap up the discussion of this particular prophecy, so Christ then brings an end to sacrifice and offering through his sacrifice in 31 AD, 3.5 years after the beginning of his ministry. So, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. Now, that is an interesting discussion. The Masoretic text states it this way, and upon the wing of detestable things shall be that which causes appallment, until the extermination wholly determined be poured out upon that which causes appallment. The passage here is dealing more with something that is done that causes desolation later. And it's a bit of a mistranslation for it to say, it shall be one who makes desolate, as if it's an individual. It's more dealing with, as most of the commentaries and translations bring out, it's more dealing with an act or actions or a thing that causes there to be a desolate situation. So in terms of looking at that, then, we come to several conclusions in verses 24 through 27. One, and this is from the paper. One, we believe that the prophecy extends for 490 years, and it's divided into three parts: the 7 weeks, the 62 weeks, that makes 69 weeks, and then the 1 week. So the final 7 years. We believe that the 70th week is divided into 2 equal parts of 3.5 years each. So Christ's first part of his ministry, the 3.5 years of what he did, as we see happening in part in the first 3 points, but then also the things that will happen in the final 3.5 years of his ministry. Our understanding, as best as we can tell, is that time has not taken place yet. That final 3.5 years of Christ's ministry has not yet happened. Now, I'll read on. We believe that the prophecy begins with the decree of Artaxerxes in 457 BC. We believe that the first 69 weeks of the prophecy ended in 27 AD when Christ was baptized and began his ministry. We believe that the Messiah was cut off in the midst of the 70th week, Daniel 9:27, after 3.5 years of confirming or strengthening the covenant, magnifying the law. His being cut off, sacrificing himself, brought an end to the need for animal sacrifices for the people of God. We believe that there are yet 3.5 years of confirming the covenant to be fulfilled. The most likely scenario for this fulfillment is the beginning of the millennium. Christ returns, sets up his throne. Millennium begins sometime around that time of Christ returning, defeating Satan, and this finishing of his ministry. We believe that Christ was cut off and killed in the midst of a literal week on a Wednesday. We believe that the abomination of desolation will be set up in Jerusalem, in the holy place. The man of sin, king of the north, the beast, the man of sin, as false prophet, will come into Jerusalem. And at some point, animal sacrifices, which have previously been allowed either on the altar or potentially in a new temple to be built, we don't know on that for sure, but that there would be an altar, that will be stopped. This is the taking away of the daily sacrifice as spoken of in Daniel 12. Christ's fulfillment of Daniel 9:27 isn't the same event as the taking away of the sacrifices, because, again, what we said, Christ's sacrifice brought an end to the need to sacrifice. The abomination of desolation over here is dealing with stopping the Jews from sacrificing in the end time. So we see these two concepts going on. Let's go finally, if we could, to Matthew 24. So where they get the 7-year tribulation is by putting Daniel 9:27, he as being an individual who comes in and makes this covenant only to break it 3.5 years in and do what he does. We do not believe that is the case. I hope the description that I gave to you is not clear as mud. I hope it made some sense. I'd be happy to discuss that with you further. But while we turn to Matthew 24 to conclude, one of the things that also, getting back to the initial discussion that was on the radio that I found interesting of where some folks can get off on this when they see America as a major player at the very end, because America, they believe, is going to side with Israel in the end and help Israel, along with Christ's return, to defeat the armies of Satan in this global power. What's the problem with that construct? Well, the problem is, again, with a lack of an understanding of who Israel is. And that's one of the beauties of the truths of that God has revealed to his people of who Israel is. Israel, the descendants of Israel, America, Britain, and the Commonwealth. What is the situation that these nations will be in prior to the return of Christ? They're going to be in captivity. They're going to be decimated. Very few left. Some scriptures lead us to believe that maybe a tenth of the descendants of Jacob will be around at the return of Christ. They're not going to be this powerful force that's somehow protected in Revelation 12 to come and then fight on Christ's side at the very end. With the understanding of who Israel is in prophecy opens up our eyes to realize this isn't talking about America down the stretch battling it out. It's in Revelation 12, it's talking about the church that is protected as the beast comes after, as the dragon comes after to swallow up the church, and they are protected for 3.5 years. So with all of that said, I hope that it's been an interesting study for us as we've gone back and looked at this 70 weeks prophecy. I can get more information to you if you'd like to read that more. But let's conclude in Matthew 24, because with all of this, prophecy is interesting. And again, there will come a time, as 1 Corinthians tells us, when the prophecies will have been fulfilled. And ultimately, the key is love. Are we filled with God's love? Is God's love in us? And are we motivated by love? Not just by a knowledge of this or a knowledge of this, and we can put it all together and we can figure it all out. It means nothing if we do not have love. It means nothing if we do not continue to keep our noses in God's Bible, in His Word, and strive to live that way of life, as this passage, which you know very well, reminds us. Matthew 24, verse 42. He says, "Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming." We don't. We don't know what hour He's coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming. He's coming at an hour you do not expect. We can study and look at this and figure out this or that, but He's coming in an hour we don't expect. He says that. I believe that. He said He's coming at a time we don't expect. So what do we need to do? As we see in verse 45. "Who then is that faithful and wise servant, whom his master makes ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods." As we study God's Word, as we study prophecy, a very important part of Scripture, may we also be found so doing when our time comes, be it as David Mask's time came just this past week, or if we happen to live till the return of Christ, may we be found so doing.